The air chills, the shadows deepen, and the world outside begins to fade into a distant hum. Tonight, we gather in that quiet, unsettling space where the familiar twists into something else entirely. We'll explore the subtle shift, the lingering trace, the things that burrow into your mind and refuse to leave. These aren't tales of outright monsters, but of the creeping dread that resides closer to home, within the dust and decay of everyday life. So, turn off the lights, put your headphones on, and let the whispers begin. Prepare yourself, because once you step into the stillness, it might just follow you out again. The air in Havenwood always smelled faintly of burnt sugar, even years after the second fire. It was a sweet, cloying smell that never really left, especially not on humid summer nights like the one I'm thinking of. My family moved there when I was 17, a fresh start after my dad lost his job. Havenwood was cheap, for obvious reasons, and the house we bought was a small, two-story place on Elm Street, nothing special. It had been vacant for a long time, the yard overgrown, the paint peeling. We were the first family to live in it since the last big fire, the one that took out half the block. The first week was a whirlwind of unpacking boxes and trying to make the place feel like home. My room was on the second floor, looking out onto the street. It was a quiet street, mostly older folks who kept to themselves. I remember trying to sleep that first night, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house settling around me. The burnt sugar smell was stronger in my room, almost like someone had left a half-empty bag of cheap Halloween candy under my bed. I figured it was just the old wood. Maybe the previous owners had a sweet tooth. I pulled the covers up, trying to ignore it. A few nights later, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, more like a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from the attic directly above my room. We hadn't even looked in the attic yet, just knew it was there. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. Scrape, scrape, pause. Scrape, scrape, pause. It sounded almost like something being dragged across a wooden floor, or maybe a branch rubbing against the roof. I told myself it was just the wind or a stray animal. Old houses make noise. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sound kept pulling me back, a quiet, insistent presence above me. The next morning, the sound was gone. I mentioned it to my dad over breakfast, trying to sound casual. He just grunted, said we should probably check the attic soon, make sure there weren't any squirrels. I felt a little silly, but the scraping had been so clear, so rhythmic. Later that day, I stood under the attic door in the hallway, looking up. It was just a plain wooden door, flush with the ceiling, with a small pull-down ladder mechanism. I even reached up and pushed on it lightly, but it was sealed tight. I convinced myself it really was just the house settling, or maybe a tree branch I hadn't noticed before. It happened again a few nights later, around the same time. Scrape, scrape, pause. This time, I was fully awake almost instantly. It wasn't the wind. It was too regular, too deliberate. And it wasn't a branch, because there were no trees close enough to the roof right above my room. I sat up in bed, my heart thumping. The burnt sugar smell seemed stronger, too, almost suffocating. I gripped my phone, ready to call my parents, but then I hesitated. What would I say? There's a scraping sound in the attic? They'd tell me to go back to sleep. I just listened, trying to make sense of the sound, trying to deny what I was hearing. The scraping stopped, and then I heard something else. A soft thud, like something being placed down gently. Then another, closer to the attic door. It wasn't dragging anymore. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps, moving across the attic floor directly above my head. Each step was light, almost hesitant, but undeniably there. My breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to make it stop, trying to make it a dream. But the burnt sugar smell was too real, too strong. It felt like it was seeping into my skin, into my very bones. I just lay there, frozen, listening to the unseen presence move above me. The footsteps grew fainter, moving away from my room, towards the far end of the attic. Then silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that was almost worse than the noise. I waited, ears straining, for what felt like an eternity. Nothing. I finally worked up the courage to slowly, quietly get out of bed. I crept to my door, hand on the cold doorknob, and listened. I could hear my parents' soft snoring from down the hall. Everything felt normal, except for the lingering smell and the racing of my heart. I took a deep breath, telling myself it had to be a raccoon or some old pipes. Anything but what it felt like. The next morning, I couldn't shake it. As soon as my parents left for work, I found the pull cord for the attic ladder. It was tucked away in the back of the linen closet, stiff and dusty. I pulled it down, the old wood creaking loudly. A cloud of fine, gray ash puffed out. The air suddenly reeked of that burnt sugar smell, intensified, sickly sweet. I grabbed a flashlight and peered up. The attic was dark, filled with shadows and dust. And then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible trail in the dust on the attic floorboards, leading from the far corner directly to the trapdoor above my room. It looked like something had been dragged. Not just scraped, dragged. I didn't go up. Couldn't. The trail was too distinct, too fresh in the thick layer of gray ash that covered everything. It looked like someone or something had been moving back and forth, from one end of the attic to the other, then to the spot directly above my bed. The house had burned twice, they said. The last time a family had lived in this house. The husband, the wife, and their young daughter. They never found the daughter's body. They said the fire was so hot it probably just vaporized her. But the police report said her room was directly below the attic hatch. And the burnt sugar smell? It was strongest right over my bed. Not sugar, not wood, just ash, and something else, something trying to move again. Sometimes, the greatest horrors aren't the ones that scream, but the ones that leave a faint, persistent scent. A memory, perhaps, of something burnt away, yet still clinging to the fabric of reality. That faint wisp, just at the edge of perception, can be the hardest to shake. The scent was the first thing. Not the usual damp earth smell after a summer rain, but something drier, sharper, like old ash from a forgotten fireplace, even though it hadn't rained in days. I was 17 that summer, working at the town's small hardware store, mostly stocking shelves and sweeping up. Our town, Oakhaven, had always been a quiet place, a little forgotten, tucked away behind the bigger highway towns. It had the strange reputation, though, especially since the big fires years ago. Not just one, but two devastating blazes that had wiped out entire sections of the original settlement, decades apart. Everyone knew the stories, but they felt like history, not reality. That summer, it started to feel a lot more real. My job was pretty solitary. The store was rarely busy, especially in the late afternoons when the heat made everyone lazy. I spent a lot of time just thinking, listening to the old radio crackle. The fires were a common topic among the older folks who did wander in, always with a shake of the head and a mutter about the town being cursed. They talked about the first fire in the early 1900s, then the second one just after World War II. Both times, almost total devastation, rebuilding on the same ground. People who moved here recently thought it was just bad luck. But the lifers, they had a different kind of look in their eyes when they spoke of it. A deep, unsettling understanding. It was during one of my shifts, a Tuesday afternoon, that I first noticed the dust. Not the regular kind that settles on shelves, but a fine, almost imperceptible gray powder. I'd sweep the aisles, and an hour later, it would be back, just a whisper of gray across the polished linoleum. It didn't look like outdoor dust, more like something very old, very fine, coming from somewhere inside. I just figured the old building had some strange drafts, or maybe the vents needed cleaning. The ash smell intensified around the same time, too subtle enough to ignore most days, but definitely there, clinging to the air, especially in the back storage room where all the older, less used stock was kept. The back storage room was a maze of ancient boxes and forgotten inventory, a place where light bulbs went to die. One evening, just before closing, I was back there trying to find a specific type of plumbing fixture. It was dark, save for the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. I heard something, a faint whisper. It sounded like a conversation, muffled and distant, but definitely there. I froze, listening. Nothing. I shrugged it off as pipes settling, or maybe sounds from the alley filtering in. But the whisper had sounded too close, too distinct, like someone right behind the shelves, just out of sight. I hurried to find what I needed and got out of there, the ash smell suddenly much stronger. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent, always in the back, always just out of earshot. It was like tuning into a radio station that wasn't quite coming in clearly. I started to notice other things. Shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't directly looking at them, just at the edge of my vision. Like a dark shape darting behind a stack of paint cans. I'd whip my head around, and there would be nothing but still, dusty air. My boss, Mr. Henderson, was a kindly old man who mostly stayed in his office. He never noticed anything. He just complained about the dust, told me to sweep more thoroughly, completely oblivious to the growing unease I felt. One particularly humid evening, an hour before closing, I was in the main aisle, restocking light bulbs. The store was completely empty. That whisper started again, clearer this time, definitely sounding like multiple voices. It wasn't coming from the back room anymore. It seemed to be all around me, very low, like people murmuring just outside the entrance, but no one was there. Then, a faint crackling sound, like dry wood burning, very soft, almost imagined. The ash smell was overwhelming now, stinging my nostrils. I spun around, heart pounding, searching the empty shelves, the dusty corners. Nothing. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights, and that faint, dry crackle. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, maybe. Too much caffeine. The old building settling. But then I noticed it. On the counter near the register was an old, faded inventory list. It wasn't one of ours. It was handwritten, in looping cursive I didn't recognize, on brittle, yellowed paper. The items listed were things we hadn't carried in decades. Kerosene lamps, cast iron stoves, horse tack. And beneath the last item, scrawled in a darker, heavier hand, was a date. October 14th, 1903. The exact date of Oakhaven's first devastating fire. My blood ran cold. The fine gray dust covered the paper, as if it had settled there for years. I picked up the list, my fingers trembling slightly, felt fragile, ancient. As I held it, a faint warmth radiated from the paper. I looked up, scanning the store, and my eyes landed on a section of the wall near the back storage room that always seemed a little darker, a little recessed. I'd always thought it was just poor lighting, but now it looked like a faint, dark stain. Not just dirt, but something deeper, almost like charring underneath layers of paint. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of hushed voices, and the crackling sound intensified, no longer imagined. It was real. I clocked out that night feeling a profound chill that had nothing to do with the summer heat. I left the inventory list on Mr. Henderson's desk, hoping he'd have an explanation, though I doubted he would. The store seemed to breathe behind me as I locked the door, almost like it was exhaling that dry, ancient ash. The next morning I came in early. The store was quiet, normal, no whispering. The charring on the wall seemed less pronounced in the morning light, almost like it had faded. But the inventory list was gone from Mr. Henderson's desk. I never saw it again. He never mentioned it. I just kept sweeping the fine, gray dust, day after day, and the ash smell, though sometimes faint, never truly left the air. Felt like the store was still burning, just very, very slowly, from the inside out. The echoes fade, but the feeling remains. And as one darkness recedes, another often reveals itself, not in the open, but hidden, embedded within the very structures we build to keep ourselves safe. A quiet, persistent thrum, a warmth where there should be none. The first thing I noticed when I moved into the apartment was the faint smell, like something had been burning, but not badly. Just a trace, barely there, like an old memory clinging to the drywall. I was 23 then, fresh out of college, looking for the cheapest place I could find that wasn't a total dump. This place was on the edge of Ashfield, a town with a history, though I didn't know the specifics then. My buddy Mark helped me carry boxes up to the 3rd floor. He said the place had character. I figured it was just old, that particular kind of old house smell. The landlord, a quiet man named Mr. Henderson, just nodded when I mentioned it. Previous tenant liked their fireplace, he said, which struck me as odd since it was a modern-looking complex. No fireplaces in sight. For the first few weeks, I barely noticed it. It was just part of the background, like the hum of the refrigerator or the traffic outside. I got used to it. My routine was pretty standard: work, come home, cook something simple, maybe watch a show, then bed. The smell would sometimes intensify slightly, usually in the late afternoon. It was never strong enough to make me open windows or anything, just enough to register as still there. I started associating it with coming home, a strange kind of comfort almost. It smelled like wood smoke, but not fresh, not pleasant. More like extinguished embers, left to cool and slowly fade. It was subtle, deniable, but always present. Then came the warm spot. I was walking past the wall separating my bedroom from the living room, near the small dining nook. My arm brushed against it, and I felt a distinct warmth. It wasn't hot, just noticeably warmer than the rest of the wall, like a heating vent was behind it. But there was no vent there, just a blank expanse of painted drywall. I pressed my palm against it. It wasn't uniform. There was a specific patch, about the size of a dinner plate, that felt warmer than the surrounding areas. I figured it was some weird plumbing issue or maybe a poorly insulated pipe. I tapped on it, listened. Nothing, just a solid wall. I remember thinking, well, that's new, and then shrugging it off. Old buildings do weird things, right? The warmth became more consistent, and then the whispers started. I know how that sounds, but I swear, it wasn't a hallucination. It was incredibly faint, like a TV left on very low in another apartment, or wind whistling through a crack. But it wasn't wind, and it definitely wasn't a TV. It sounded like hushed voices, muffled and indistinct, always coming from that warm spot in the wall. I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath, trying to make out words. Sometimes it sounded like a frantic argument, other times like a mournful sigh. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just old pipes groaning, or maybe the sound was traveling from the apartment next door in a strange way. I even put a speaker next to the wall once, playing white noise, trying to drown it out. The next stage was the glow. It wasn't bright, nothing you'd notice in daylight, but at night, in the complete darkness of my apartment, I started seeing a faint, pulsing reddish-orange light emanating from the warm spot. It was like looking at embers through a thin veil. The smell of smoke intensified dramatically when the glow appeared, becoming thick and acrid, no longer just a trace. It was the smell of wood and fabric burning, still smoldering. I would lie in bed, watching that soft, pulsing light, listening to the muffled whispers that now sounded less like voices and more like a collective, strained moan. It felt like something was trapped, alive, and in agony, right there, inside the wall of my apartment. I couldn't sleep properly anymore. One night, the pulsing light grew stronger, casting long, wavering shadows across my bedroom. The heat radiating from the wall was now intense, almost painful to touch. The smoke smell was overwhelming, making my eyes water and my throat burn. The whispers were no longer muffled. They were desperate cries, echoing inside my head even when my ear wasn't against the wall. I could hear distinct words now, or fragments of them. "Help us. It's too hot. Where's the child?" It was pure terror, not from a monster, but from the raw, undeniable suffering pressing in on me from within my own home. I stood there, frozen, staring at that glowing, hot patch, knowing that something was horribly wrong, something that defied any logical explanation. It felt like the wall itself was a thin membrane, barely holding back a raging inferno. I fled that night, grabbing my keys and wallet, and spent the rest of it in my car. The next morning, I went to the local library, desperate for answers about Ashfield and its history. I started digging through old newspaper archives. That's when I found it. The Ashfield Fire of '92. Not the big one everyone knew about, but a smaller, less reported residential fire. The building I lived in, or at least the one that stood on that exact spot, had burned down. 3 families had been trapped on the 3rd floor. The firefighters couldn't reach them in time. The article mentioned a specific apartment, Unit 3B, where a young mother and her 2 children were found, huddled together, unable to escape the smoke and flames that had started, ironically, in the wall between the living room and the small dining nook. I didn't go back. I called Mr. Henderson, told him I was breaking my lease, didn't give him a reason. He sounded unsurprised, just said, "Another one." Huh? When I went back a week later to retrieve my things, the smell was gone. The wall was cool to the touch. The apartment was silent, completely empty of any strange phenomena. It was just a normal, slightly dilapidated apartment again. But I knew what had been inside that wall, what had tried to tell me its story. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, not some spectral figure. It was the echo of an agonizing moment, imprinted into the very fabric of the building, reaching out through the ashes and the plaster. It was the last breath, the final terror of those who had burned. I never moved back to Ashfield. I still sometimes catch a faint whiff of smoke, even now, years later, when I'm just sitting at home, nowhere near a fire. It's a phantom smell, a memory that clings to me. And sometimes, late at night, in the silence of my own apartment, I imagine I can hear the faintest, most indistinct murmur, like distant voices whispering through a wall. I wonder if the next tenant in Unit 3B ever noticed the smell, or the warmth, or the quiet desperation of the embers that never truly went out. Some fires, it seems, just keep smoldering, forever trapped, breathing their last, in the place they died. We carry so many burdens, some visible, some felt only in the quiet corners of our minds. But what if the weight isn't just a metaphor? What if the things we try to forget, the things we try to bury, exert a tangible, suffocating pressure, pressing down until you can barely breathe? The new asphalt driveway, laid just a month before, always looked a shade darker than the neighboring ones, almost like it was still wet. It had been like that since we moved back to Havenwood, after the second fire. I was 22 then, fresh out of college, and my parents had sunk everything they had into rebuilding our family home, one of the last on our block to be finished. The whole town felt like a fresh wound under a thin scab, everything new but still carrying the ghost of what was lost. My job was simple: oversee the final landscaping, plant the new shrubs, make the place feel like home again. It was a good distraction, physical work that kept my mind from wandering too much into the quiet parts of the house at night. Most days, I'd work until dusk, hauling bags of mulch, digging holes for rose bushes that would hopefully bloom in the spring. The air always had a faint, gritty quality, a kind of dryness that settled on your tongue even when there wasn't a visible haze. It was the ash, people said, still fine and suspended in the atmosphere from the last inferno. It was everywhere. We'd sweep it off the porch, wipe it from window sills, but it always returned, a thin, gray dusting over everything. It became a part of life, like the quiet hum of the new power lines, or the way the streetlights cast long, unfamiliar shadows on brand new sidewalks. One afternoon, I came inside for a glass of water, leaving my work gloves and trowel on the newly laid kitchen counter. The floor, a light gray tile, was spotless. My mom had just cleaned it that morning, meticulously. But as I walked to the sink, I noticed it. A single faint footprint near the back door, just beyond where my own muddy shoes had been. It wasn't a human footprint, not clearly defined like a boot or a sneaker. It was more like a smudge, a swirl in the fine layer of ash that always seemed to settle, even indoors. It was small, delicate, like a child's foot, but it was just one, and it was too perfectly formed to be an accidental scuff. I stared at it for a moment, trying to rationalize it away. Maybe it was a bird? But how would a bird get inside and leave only one mark, so low to the ground? Or perhaps one of the construction workers had come back for something and kicked off their shoe, leaving a dirty sock print? It was a flimsy explanation, even to me. I knew the house was locked. We were the only ones with keys. I knelt down, tracing the faint outline with my finger. It felt like nothing, just ash, but the impression was undeniably there. I shook my head, grabbed my water, and went back outside, telling myself I was just seeing things. The stress of rebuilding, the subtle creep of the town's history, it was getting to me. Over the next few days, I started noticing more of them. Not just in the kitchen, but in the hall leading to the laundry room, and once even in the unused guest bathroom. Always faint, always just a single mark, never a trail. They were all different shapes, too. Some were small, almost like a thumbprint pressed into the dust. Others more elongated, like a flattened hand. They appeared and disappeared, sometimes gone by morning, only to reappear in a different spot later that day. I started leaving small objects, a coin, a button on the floor near where I'd seen them, just to see if they'd be disturbed. They never were. The ash marks would just appear around them, pristine and unsettling. The quiet of the new house started to feel less peaceful and more watchful. I found myself pausing at the top of the stairs, listening for anything beyond the hum of the refrigerator. The ash marks, by then, were almost a daily occurrence. They weren't scary in a jump-scare way, but they built a slow, quiet dread. It was the knowledge that something was moving inside the house when no one was there, or perhaps when I was there, just out of sight. A cold, crawling feeling would start in my gut and spread. It was like living with a ghost, not of a person, but of a presence, a weight that settled alongside the ash. One evening, I was alone. My parents were out to dinner, celebrating the last payment on the house. I was trying to relax with a book in the living room, but the quiet was too heavy. I kept looking at the floor, at the polished wood, half expecting a mark to appear right there. I decided to make myself a cup of tea. Walking into the kitchen, I flipped on the light, and there it was on the tile right in the center of the room. Not a smudge, not a vague print, but a perfect, unbroken circle, about the size of a teacup saucer, pressed into the ash. It was too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. It looked like something had just sat there, waiting. I stood frozen, staring at it. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly dense, like it was resisting my breathing. It wasn't just cold. It felt heavy, pressing down. I could almost feel the weight of whatever had made that mark. It wasn't just a trace left behind. It felt like a current presence. I slowly backed away, my eyes locked on the ash circle. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet felt rooted. I thought about calling my parents, but what would I say? There's a perfect circle of ash on the floor, and I think something is in the house. They tell me I was tired or imagining things, and I wouldn't blame them. Then, as I stood there, a terrifying thought clicked into place. The first fire, years ago, had destroyed our original house on this very spot. The second one, just last year, had taken the temporary structure built in its place. The ash wasn't just from the air. It was from our own home, from our belongings, from the very foundations. And the marks, they weren't footprints. They were impressions, dents, places where something had settled. Not walking, but just landing. Each time a little heavier. Each time a little more defined. The house wasn't just rebuilt on ash. It was built into it, and whatever was leaving those marks was part of it, too. I didn't stay in the kitchen. I turned off the light, walked quickly to my room, and locked the door. I didn't sleep much that night. Every subtle creak of the new house, every settling of wood, sounded like something pressing down, shifting its weight. The circle was gone by morning, swept away by my mom before I even saw it. I never told my parents. We still live in that house. The ash still settles everywhere. And sometimes, usually when I'm alone, I still see them. A faint, undeniable impression in the dust, a momentary indentation, as if something has briefly, quietly, just landed. And I know, with a dreadful certainty, that it's still here, steadily compacting itself into the foundations, growing heavier with every passing day. These aren't just stories. They're reflections of the quiet anxieties that can gnaw at the edges of our perception. They linger because they tap into that primal fear of the unknown, of the things that leave an imprint long after they're gone, reminding us that sometimes the most unsettling truths are the ones we uncover ourselves. The ash settles, the embers cool, but the memory of the heat remains. For a new story every week, consider joining us here at Scareverse.